and thank you for watching a video produced by the instructional coaches in the professional learning department. Today's professional learning is called Creating a Rigorous Classroom Culture, an Overview. My name is Dean Stevenson and I'm one of the presenters for today's presentation, and I'm accompanied by Jennifer Borders, another instructional coach in the professional learning department. Though a discussion around a rigorous classroom culture is always relevant, it is especially important now as we think about how do we help students address the unfinished learning they have from the past 2 years while also helping them accomplish grade level content currently. Prince William County has put out the Launching Thriving Futures document, which is our plan for how we're going to address that unfinished learning. What you're going to notice as a theme throughout the document, and what's going to be the focus of much of what we talk about today, is the idea of acceleration. When we talk about acceleration, what we really are talking about is the idea of accelerating learning, or in other words, getting students caught up to grade level despite the fact that they have more they need to learn from previous years as well as this year's content. Within the document itself, there is a set of guiding principles and considerations. You'll notice that within those guiding principles and considerations, the first 2 bullet points address the idea of accelerating learning directly. The first bullet states, acceleration of learning is necessary for all students to address unfinished learning. In other words, all students need to have this happen if we are going to help them get to grade level and recover from the unfinished learning over the previous 2 years. The second guiding principle states, access to rigorous high-quality grade level content learning for all students. In other words, if we are going to accelerate learning, it is not about going back and teaching previous grade content that students may have missed, but rather implementing effective strategies and expectations around grade level content and supporting and scaffolding as needed as students move forward on that grade level content. When thinking about what effective strategies help to accelerate learning, we can draw from John Hattie's research in visible learning. In John Hattie's research, he looks at meta-analyses of all sorts of different teacher strategies and puts them into one of 4 categories. Though there could be a lot discussed about these 4 categories, what's important is what is on the right side. The right side of this graphic represents the zone of desired effects. And what that means is that these are different teaching strategies that help students gain more than one grade level over the course of a year. In other words, they accelerate student learning so that they can get caught up based off their unfinished learning. There are a plethora of different strategies that fall inside of this zone, and we are going to focus on several of them in our upcoming videos around rigor. Some of those things that we're going to talk about include the idea of classroom discussions, response to intervention, cognitive task analysis, and collective teacher efficacy. When you look at all of these strategies as a whole, the theme that comes out is the idea that all of these, when put together, build a rigorous classroom culture, which will be the focus of this video and the future videos we have in our rigor series. For all of these videos, the question that will underlie what we talk about is how do we build a rigorous classroom culture so that we continue to live in the zone of desired effects and accelerate learning for all students. Now that we've laid a foundation as to why a rigorous classroom culture is critical to accelerating student learning, we'd like to give you a few seconds to think about your own beliefs around a rigorous classroom culture. Please pause the video and consider the question on the screen. Throughout the remainder of this video and the rest of our videos around rigor, we will be trying to talk about this question and how we believe different instructional strategies may help build a rigorous classroom culture. For today's video, we'd like you to consider the learning outcomes on the following screen. Our learning outcomes for today are to be able to identify components of a rigorous classroom culture, define rigor relative to K-12 learning, and connect rigor to Bloom's taxonomy and Webb's depth of knowledge. So let's get into it. The first thing is we need a functional definition of rigor if we're going to talk about how we build a rigorous classroom culture. We pull our definition for rigor from Blackburn 2017. This definition states, rigor is creating an environment in which each student is expected to learn at high levels. In other words, some students may find this difficult while others don't find it as difficult, but we do not adjust our expectations so that all students find it easy. This leads us to the second part of the definition. Rigor is creating an environment in which each student is supported so he or she can learn at a high level. So regardless of how difficult a student finds the rigorous material, they're given the appropriate supports and scaffolds so they can still achieve at those high rigorous levels. So this leads us to the idea that rigor is not automatic. We have to provide supports and scaffolds as teachers to help students attain rigorous high expectations. That leads us to the third piece of the definition. Rigor is creating an environment in which each student demonstrates learning at a high level. This means that rigor is not teacher-based. A teacher can implement what they believe to be rigorous materials in their classroom, but if a student cannot demonstrate learning at a high level, then rigor did not take place. Putting these three pieces together creates our working definition of rigor. Now, with any definition, there are also sometimes misinterpretations. We're going to call those common misconceptions. Some of the most prevalent misconceptions around rigor in schools are things such as harder activities. If the students are given tasks that are much more difficult, they are automatically attaining rigor. Enrichment. If students get the baseline things done, then they can access rigor. More work. If students do more things during class, they are being given a more rigorous curriculum. Faster. If students can do things at a quicker pace, then they are doing more rigor in their classes. Advanced students only. So only students who are in advanced classes access rigorous curriculum. High test scores. Teachers who have high test scores must have had a rigorous classroom culture. And teacher instructs at high levels. So as long as a teacher does and says things that appear to be rigorous, it does not matter if the student can demonstrate at that same level. In the remainder of this video and in our future videos, we are going to discuss how do we build a rigorous classroom culture that does not fall victim to these common misconceptions and allows us to accelerate learning for all students.
Okay, so let's go ahead and take a moment to start thinking about how we frame rigor. And I want to start us off with this idea of difficulty. So when we're talking about difficulty, really what we're doing is we're talking about a procedural task that we want students to do. Now that task works on a continuum. So when we talk about procedural tasks, it might be something that we are doing with students that is easy. It doesn't take a lot of time. The prep is low key, or it could span to something that is hard. That might require more time, more preparation, more resources in order to complete the task. So when we think about difficulty, really what we're talking about is just what we have to do procedurally, the nuts and bolts of the activity in order to complete it. The other idea that we want to think about is cognitive demand. And here really what we're talking about is what are we asking of students in terms of their processing and understanding in order to complete a task. And again, this is going to be on a continuum, just like difficulty. The cognitive demand might be simple. It's not a particularly demanding task for them in terms of processing. There's automaticity that they have in place, that sort of muscle memory, if you will, up to a more complex task, which really gets them into that deeper metacognitive thinking and gets them really looking at discourse. And so when we think about cognitive demand and difficulty, these two ideas are really going to be the catalyst for how we create activities for rigorous classroom culture. So let's see how these intersect. When these ideas come together, what we're doing is we're creating a quadrant of learning opportunities. And those opportunities could be easy to hard in terms of the nuts and bolts procedural piece of the activity, and then the cognitive demand from simple to complex. So let's take a look at an activity like a fluency building task. Perhaps you're having students work on math fact fluency. Where might that fall on this particular quadrant? That's an easy preparation, an easy task to put out there in terms of the nuts and bolts and the procedural piece of it. It's also very simple in what we're asking them to do. When they're building fluency, this is becoming muscle memory. They're working at an independent level. The cognitive demand is simple. So that's an example of an activity that would fall into an easy, simple piece of this quadrant. Let's take a look at stamina. Oftentimes we'll ask our students to engage in independent reading, and we want them to build up their reading stamina, and that's true from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. So when we're working on a stamina activity like independent reading, can be a little bit more difficult in terms of just the procedures of it. Getting text into their hand that is at their independent level so that they can access the text, making sure we have adequate time for them to engage in independent reading, that they're able to continually do so in a way that allows them to build up that stamina and increase how long they can read. It can be a little bit more difficult in terms of planning for that and making the time for that kind of activity. But the cognitive demand is still a little bit more simple. They're reading at an independent level, so they don't need the scaffolding and support to process and comprehend the text like they would if they were working on an instructional level. So that's an example of a task or learning opportunity we might have students doing that falls into this simple, hard part of our quadrant. Strategic thinking is a really good example of where we can fall into that easy, complex part of the quadrant. If we teach our students thinking routines, for example, that they can apply across multiple content areas, it becomes very easy from a procedural standpoint for them to engage in a thinking routine because you've taught those processes. It becomes automatic for them. But as it changes with the content that they're doing, that strategic thinking is coming in, and it's a more cognitively complex activity that we're asking them to do. We're asking them to take this strategy that is easy, that they've mastered, and apply it again and again with new learning. And so getting that strategic thinking in something like a thinking routine into play is a learning opportunity that we would see as easy on the procedural side, but complex on the cognitive demand side. And then in this last part of our quadrant here is this idea around productive struggle. And so this would be an activity that from a procedural standpoint might be difficult to put out there for students, but it's also cognitively complex. We're really pushing their thinking. And a good example of a productive struggle type of activity you might engage students in would be a jigsaw. There's a lot of procedural pieces that come into play in planning a quality jigsaw opportunity, but it's also, again, really getting them to engage in that group discussion and think deeply around a particular concept or idea, sharing those thoughts, having that discourse, and processing through that. That's a high complex cognitive demand kind of activity. When we plan learning opportunities for our students, we want to make sure that we are giving them a chance to work in each of these different quadrants. A rigorous classroom culture is going to have a combination of learning opportunities that hit on all of these areas, not just one. Sometimes it's easy to think, oh, we just want students to be working in productive struggle and we don't want them to use class time to work on fluency or stamina, but really we do. We want them working in all of these areas. So we need to be intentional in how we plan for that, and we do that by really kind of focusing in our CLTs on this particular idea of cognitive demand and really dissecting what we want students to do to understand where does it fall on this simple to complex scale here in terms of that cognitive processing. One way that Prince William County analyzes the cognitive level of a standard, a question, a task, or really any learning experience is by using Bloom's taxonomy. The lowest category or level, remember, requires students to recall facts and basic concepts. The next level, understand, requires a little higher thinking from students and asks them to explain ideas or concepts. With apply, we're asking students to use learned material in new and concrete situations. As we move up the pyramid to analyze, we start asking students to break down material into component parts. With evaluate, we're requiring that students use their own judgment and start assigning value with their learning. create tops our pyramid with the most complex and highest level of thinking that we ask of students. And really what we're requiring of them is to design and construct or produce new and original work that captures their learning. Another framework utilized in Prince William County is Webb's Depth of Knowledge, or DOK. It defines criteria for judging the alignment between expectations and assessments. So in other words, it's a way to think about content complexity. Level 1 is acquired knowledge, which involves recall and reproduction. So students remember facts or define a procedure. Level 2 is knowledge application of skills and concepts. Here we're asking students to use previously learned concepts to answer questions. Level 3 is analysis, which involves strategic thinking. Complexity is starting to increase here and involves planning, justification, and some complex reasoning. The student has to explain how concepts and procedures can be used to provide results. Level 4 is augmentation, which is extended thinking. This requires the student to go beyond the standard learning and ask, how else can the learning be used in real-world contexts? Both frameworks are different approaches to understanding the rigor teachers are asking of their students in the tasks, the questions, and the assessments that are given. Let's circle back to our definition of rigor. When we keep this definition in mind, it's easy to see how these frameworks allow teachers to align their expectations to the work they are asking their students to produce. To think more deeply about rigor and how to embed it throughout instruction, we are building a series that goes into different aspects of a rigorous classroom culture. In the first part of the definition, we are looking at our expectations for students. To accelerate learning, we must keep our expectations high and teach at grade level. In the upcoming second and third parts of our rigor series, we will look at how we do just that. In part 2, we will take time to explore how we unpack standards. In part 3, we will discuss how to align assessments and tasks to the standards we unpack. Yet we know just because we set high expectations does not mean that students will automatically meet them. In our fourth session of the series, we're going to take a look at how we support and scaffold for all students through instructional moves and setting expectations with our students. In our final session of the series, we're going to look at how we orchestrate discussions and leverage that for accelerating learning. And finally, in staying true to our definition about rigor, we do want to make sure that each student demonstrates learning at high levels. And so that is a theme that you will see embedded throughout sessions 3, 4, and 5. As we close out our time together, let's reframe our visualization from earlier in the session. Based on your new learning, what has changed in your visualization of a rigorous classroom culture? On behalf of the Professional Learning Department, Dean and I would like to say thank you for joining us for our session today on rigor. We do hope that you come back and join us for the upcoming sessions. Please check out our Canvas course for those sessions as they will be coming soon. If you would like to learn more about rigor, please consider visiting the resources cited here in our bibliography. Again, thank you for joining us, and if you have any questions or need any additional support around rigor, please feel free to reach out. We are with the Professional Learning Department, and we can be reached through our email there. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming sessions.